Hi, I'm Julie Thompson. Welcome to the Duxbury School Committee Candidate Interviews. I want to take a moment to thank the candidates for participating in this interview and collaborating with PAC TV to bring this informational programming to residents and voters this election season. Let me explain the format. We will be conducting a one-on-one interview style Q&A format with each candidate, lasting about 30 minutes. Responses will not be timed, and follow-up questions may be asked during this format. We aim to ask up to 4 or 5 questions, but that will depend on the length of the responses along with any follow-up discussion during this exchange. Candidates will be allowed to address anything not covered or that they'd like to add clarification to at the end of the interview in their closing remarks. Let's get started. Today we're speaking with Sean Dadsetan-Foley, one of the 3 candidates for school committee in Duxbury town election. Sean, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, I'm going to ask you some questions and we're going to time it for 30 minutes. And here we go. One of the many responsibilities of a school committee member is to advocate on behalf of students and their schools and promote the benefits of the school system to the community. What impression do you want to give of the Duxbury school system, and how would your advocacy showcase all that the district has to offer?
Absolutely. So one of the things that my family and I first experienced when we moved to Duxbury is that there was excitement around talking about, one of 2 things: it's the beaches and the schools. And for us, that was a clear introduction as to how much pride and how much history the school community has played in the role of Duxbury and how that has formed this community. And I think it's one of those opportunities where we see this growth and this transition in education and a desire to make sure that our school district is following that growth and that trend towards, COVID forced us into this kind of free fall into educational technology, but educational technology was always the ultimate goal for the educational landscape. Doing online, doing remote work, being as equitable as possible to bring education into every single household. Being able to bring education to your non-traditional, learners. So when we talk about how do we advocate for a district, we need to make sure that our district is performing to the standards that we want them and we expect them to be performing in. And I think you can pull that out of a lot of the individuals and a lot of the communities and a lot of the additional work that's happening in the Duxbury community around education. You have incredible support programs. You have amazing extracurriculars. You have the Duxbury Student Union. You have the Duxbury Education Fund. And these are all entities that are doing some incredible work, but the communication lines don't seem to necessarily be there in an intentional way so that one can benefit from the other and benefit from the other. So when I'm thinking about how do we advocate for a district to grow as best as possible, we want to be able to grab those individuals, those stories, and we want to be able to highlight them as best as possible. And we also want to be as reflective of what the history of Duxbury has been like, but we also want to create a space that's opening and welcoming to individuals who may not necessarily identify in a community that is what Duxbury is right now. We want to bring in talent, we want to bring in diversity, we want to not just bring it in, but we also want to create the sense of belonging. We want to create a space where somebody can step into Duxbury and say, I absolutely belong here. And no one's going to make me feel like I'm othered or, part of a community that just was never meant to be here.
Right.
So I think when we're talking about that growth and that aspect of how do we advocate, we do it from a place where we talk about how Duxbury is a place for human beings first.
Okay.
Because that's what we are. We're human beings before we're students.
Right, absolutely. Now, I've noticed, people have written in when we ask for questions, that an awful lot of the coverage of Duxbury is the sports. Now, how do you circle that square with the fact that there's so many other programs, and granted the sports program is wonderful in Duxbury, how do you give the same highlight to other types of programs that go on in the whole school system?
Sure. Sports are exciting. Sports tend to be in the fabric of a lot of our lives. I was a collegiate baseball player, so for me, sports is very much an exciting thing. I can drive past a high school baseball field and just, spend 15 minutes watching 2 teams that I've never seen before, and enjoy every second of it. But when we're talking about how do we advocate or how do we support those programs that aren't as glorified,
Right.
or do not get the entire complexes created to support this. I think that's where we need to double down into exploring some of these creative options, doing some partnerships with local universities to really bring some value to these young learners who can then project what the skill set can provide for them in terms of professional opportunity or just enhancing their own day-to-day life.
Yep.
I think we have a great opportunity. Duxbury's median age is 54 years old, so we have this huge untapped resource of intergenerational learning, whether it happens with local universities, whether it happens with other school districts, or whether it happens with professionals who are sitting in our own backyard.
Right.
We need to be able to take advantage of that and lean into the experience and expertise that those individuals have. Because I think that's, aside from dipping our hands into this hidden pocket of funds where we could just throw thousands of dollars at programs and make them as flashy as possible, we need to start tapping into those resources that we already have.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Second question. When it comes to decision making, it can be a process to balance opposing views when working towards a solution. As an advocate for families and educators, how do you manage the decision making process when there's no simple, straightforward path to a resolution?
So, unfortunately/fortunately, this is a lot of what I do in my day-to-day work. At Massasoit Community College, I do a lot of student advocacy, but oftentimes that advocacy is seen as being in contention with something else.
Yep.
Whether it be a disagreement with a faculty member or a family member who doesn't necessarily agree with the way that their brother or their sister, their child is trying to take their life path. And I think what really it dials down to is having as much transparency as possible in the conversation. I think a lot of the disconnect and the disagreement comes from misunderstanding. And that's not to discredit anybody's inability to understand. It's just these are some conversations that have to do with some pretty intense subject matter. And you vote, you hire professionals to come in because they've understood this language, this culture, and they know based on best practices how to make those decisions. Granted, they may be incredibly tough ones and they may have incredibly tough results to them, but the more that we're able to be transparent with that process and the more that we're able to not just make decisions, but then be able to relay that out to the community so that it doesn't fall on just your layman community member to also understand exactly what happened.
Right.
Because oftentimes they're just seeing the result. They're not seeing the difficult conversation that goes into building that.
Right, yeah. And as a follow-up to that, with the use of social media, which is so widespread, do you see it affecting the decision-making process of the committee in general? And should school committee members actually engage in online discussions or debates?
So I think when it comes to engaging in discussion or debate, I lean back into what the expectations of school committee members and what is written in terms of open forum. I think when you take the individual out of their role as school committee member, they're still a member of the community. They can, vote for whoever they want. They can watch whatever TV shows they want. And that's not to say that there aren't social repercussions of just day-to-day life.
Right.
My neighbor may put something in their lawn that I don't necessarily agree with. I'll have a reaction to that.
Right.
But to know that they are a member of the school committee, I think that's an opportunity for us to say, well, there are expectations within the role to talk about things that are not necessary to or you don't necessarily, there are things within the school committee that you're not allowed to bring into conversation outside of that setting.
Right.
So as long as, you understand whatever social cost that your actions play, whether you feel like it's in support of something or going against something else. But I do believe.
What if it's setting the record straight? What if something is a statement is made and the school committee voted on something last night and then it's posted exactly opposite of what you voted on? Can't you, as a member of that committee, correct that person? Or
if it was incorrect information that was shared?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was asking for a clarification. So if a decision was made in this example last night by school committee, and then it was shared out the following day
Wrong.
incorrectly,
Yes, right.
then I think that there needs to be some level of, obviously, reparation of fixing that communication if
Right.
it is in fact incorrect.
Okay.
Whether that exists in a social media realm,
Yeah.
I think that's a discussion that I think maybe needs to evolve in terms of how school committee operates.
Yeah.
Right. We talked about last year, and there's still continuation of just the engagement levels and
Yeah.
the avenues in which community members can engage with school committee. And I think it's a two-way street. How does school committee continue to engage outward?
Right.
And one of the school committee members had a great initiative that kind of broke down our the 2-hour school committee sessions into kind of the digestible and heavy decision-making tidbits for anybody who wasn't able to watch and present, or
Yeah.
can't find that 2 hours
Yeah.
to be able to sneak it
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely, and as going back to that technology and how we're trending education-wise, I think it's just a great opportunity for the school committee to also be trending in a way that is a little bit more responsive to how technology can be a tool.
Sure. Okay, perfect. Excellent, thank you. Okay, question number 3. School budgets can make up a significant percentage of the town's budget. How do you get the best bang for the dollar when balancing the district's contracts, the curriculum, the student needs, the facility upkeep, and current technology, while trying to keep the budget within a reasonable range?
Sure. And I know that that's a big conversation coming up with Duxbury's town meeting later on this month.
Tell me about that.
So there, I'll talk specifically about how the school budget weighs in on that. School budget comes in at just below 50% of the town's operating budget, or at least as it's proposed by the town manager. And in December, the schools submitted a proposed budget for level services at an increase of, I believe it was 2.6%, which is, definitely within that range of what yearly increases need to look like. It's usually between 2 and 3% of an increase. But what I really appreciate that the administration did this year was that they did a community poll, and they received about 600-700 responses.
That's great.
That asked community members, what do you feel like the school district needs to, put the money where the mouth is and provide some funding for.
Right.
And that turned into, a level services plus budget of an increase of about 4.6%. So, going from about $39.8 million up to, low 40 million. And then what was proposed by the town manager was a cutback on that a little bit. So level budget, was hit with a little bit extra, but there's this gap of 1%, which translates into about $400,000.
Right.
Which is, you hear 1% and that's one thing, but you hear $400,000 and that's a huge influx of money that can go to support so many additional programs.
Right.
So, going back to that, we have so many different players and so many different resources within the community. When you think, and you have to start thinking creatively with a fixed budget,
Right.
you start to lean into those in-kind services. You start to lean into places like the Duxbury Education Fund that can provide, varying level grants to be able to support some of these initiatives. The last thing you want to do is to kind of squash the hope of somebody who is hoping to get an initiative off the ground. And while you may not be able to meet that need 100% financially, you can at least understand, there's comfort in knowing that there are some resources that may exist there for you to be able to build some momentum and lead into an opportunity to then advocate in a following year to the schools and say, this is something that we've piloted. We're able to do it, very low tech, but now we've shown the need, we've shown the desire, and we want to keep growing that. I think additionally, 81% of our school budget goes to salaries.
Right.
So that only leaves, just under 20% left for your year-to-year, your maintenance and whatnot. And all of those are on contracts that, increase year after year.
Right.
And so what I would encourage, or I would continue to support the district in doing, is really looking critically at those year-to-year contracts, especially the ones that are kind of closing their contract end dates, doing market comparisons of what other service providers can come in, give us equal resources, equal level of support, maybe for a better deal.
Can you give me an example of like a couple of these contracts you're talking about?
Whether it be through bus transportation
Okay.
or some
These
of the
aren't teacher
additional
contracts.
no, not
These are-
teacher
okay.
contracts at all.
Yeah.
These are all outside of any teacher admin admin costs. And ultimately, what you want to be able to do is to start to pull some of those funds back, some of that money back, especially for programs that, as we go year after year, some of them may not be serving your community as effectively as they once were.
Right.
And if they're not growing, then you need to find somebody new that can do it.
Right.
And so what I would love to see within the context of being able to reclaim some of that money, get back that, that $400,000 that we, are not, it's no
Can't
longer
have
on the
anymore.
table.
Right.
I would love to see that reinvested back into what I believe is the most critical piece to a successful school community, which is the teachers. Duxbury is no different than what's going on nationally. Teachers are criminally underpaid. And in order to grow a district, you need to keep your talent.
Yeah.
You need to foster their development. You need to be able to bring professional opportunities into those spaces. You have to nurture that growth, because that's where you're going to be able to get a community that says, I really resonate with how education is brought to our students. So I would love to see, yes, being able to hit those additional programs that maybe got missed in the actual budget that the town is providing,
Yep.
but to also redirect as much of those funds back to the teachers, because that's where the learning happens.
Right.
That's where the relationships are made, and that's where the students are going to really connect with what an educational experience is like.
Exactly. Okay, let me follow up. What significant improvements could be made without using budget funds and being creative with the funding you have? Zero budget stuff. What can you do that doesn't cost anything?
So the zero budget conversation is one I'm very familiar with, coming from the nonprofit world where you had budgets of zero. It was figure out how to make this happen. And I think I mentioned this earlier, I think one of the most untapped resources that we have in Duxbury are its community members. And I think one of the most unfortunate things that I heard throughout my campaign last year was I would go up to somebody and I would, ask them if they'd like to hear about my candidacy for a school committee, and they'd say, I don't have any kids in the system. The school doesn't really mean anything to me. And I'd like to bring them back to that budget and say, well, the town says 50% of what's going into the town goes into the school. So it could and it should mean something, but I think there's another opportunity that education right now has an opportunity to span generations. And I think with a community that is as invested in Duxbury in all of its forms, whether it be sports, academics, culture, I think we have to really lean into some intergenerational learning. I had the fortune of joining the DEI Youth Intergenerational Task Force back in the fall, and it was great to see freshman students, recent high school grads who are still in town, college grads who are in town, professionals, individuals who are retired and just care about it, to all be in the same shared space and having this conversation. And you had students talking about things that at that age I never had the space to be able to share how I felt about, what was going on in my classroom or what was going on in a global context.
Yeah.
And to be able to hear that comment and then hear that supported by somebody who's, there's an age gap of maybe 70 years, be able to come in and support. And you just see this incredible moment of learning where it's not just our school age community members that are receiving it. It's everybody that's in that space.
Everybody wins.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think when we're talking about, what doesn't cost anything, it's our ability to connect with one another. And I think that's something that we really need to lean into. And I think that really does address this feeling that if you don't have kids in the system, then you don't have a connection to the schools, where it's a public school, we're part of the public, it's our school.
Right.
It's everyone's school. and we should be involved in it.
Okay, good. Question 4. The school district has recently handled some personnel matters in a very public way. In situations like this, how does a school committee member balance the need for transparency and providing information in a timely manner with the need to follow the process and the law?
Absolutely. So I think the law component of that is what you need to lead with, because again, as I've been talking about, we are humans first, and I think there's a human element that needs to be respected. At the same time, I know we're an invested community that wants to know how our educational landscape is going to be navigated and who's going to be at the helm. And when you have individuals who have, spotlight stories that tend to take over community, it's hard to be able to shy away from at least addressing it or at least having a constructive conversation about it. There is no conversation, though, that can undo what had been done. There's only conversation looking forward to how do we make adjustments and changes, how do we bring in the right individuals, and how do we advocate for our community members to step in and speak up when they feel something incorrect and inappropriate is happening.
Something is amiss.
And I think that's, as much as you share out, decision making and deciding to move forward, and again, you will have community response to that, whether it be in favor, whether it be against. And I think, the best you can do is communicate that out and then still respect, again, that privacy, that lawful privacy issue. But I think the biggest thing that we can do is just advocate that everyone should feel comfortable and no one should feel bullied into not being able to speak up when they feel like there's some injustice or something inappropriate that's happening.
Okay. And to follow up with that, when you're handling a sensitive situation like this, how do you keep the trust of the families and the community while at the same time making sure you follow the correct steps, which may not allow for a lot of the information to go public? And that tends to be, I think, the bottom line is, well, what really happened? I want to know exactly what happened, and I deserve to know. Yeah. And I'm sure you've heard that, or anyone in the school committee has heard that.
Absolutely. I mean, we're human beings. We have a need to know with everything. Yeah. And this is no different. And I understand that there's frustration of somebody wanting to know every single detail so that they can feel that same justification in a decision as the decision makers did, because they got to get eyes on it. And I think this is, again, we want to be able to build trust. We want to be able to build that. And that comes from relationship building. That comes from having the same faces involved in the same spaces. So ultimately, how do we get there? It's having as many interactions and having as many engagements as possible. It's not always going to be, the terrible news that we have to gather over. Right. There can be some positivity that we as a community get to celebrate. And I think we've kind of, definitely in the last 2 years, there's been a whole lot more to mourn and grieve over than there has been to celebrate. And, I'm excited for, again, don't want to jinx anything, but that things are trending back to a pre-COVID type of setting where we can be in those spaces to celebrate. We can be in those spaces to talk about the positive things that are happening. We can begin to see each other as supports rather than obstacles. Because I think there's been this huge just push towards the me versus you, where we really need to get back to the us versus the issue type of approach.
Agreed. Okay, I'm going to ask you a bonus question. What you decide during your time on the school committee will affect the students of tomorrow. How far into the future do you look to see the impact that you could make as a school committee member right now? And I'm really wanting this to be in terms of how do you decide what curriculums and what things you bring in now that are going to be important 5-10 years from now. For example, we never used to talk about, we always used to talk about kids would always go to college. You got to prep kids to go to college. And now there's a trend moving away from that. And what about trade schools? There's all kinds of new things and certificate programs. So talk about that in terms of the curriculum, K through 12. How do you do this?
Absolutely. I am a huge proponent of project-based learning. I think as valuable as a physical classroom is to harbor that learning, getting out into the world, being able to apply critically what you're learning and using it in real-world scenarios, I think is just as, if not more important than being book smart in that subject matter. And absolutely, I think, I was brought up in a system where if you didn't go to a four-year university or if you took a gap year, you were like, well, what's wrong with
what
what
wrong
happened?
with you, Sean? Yes.
And I definitely, was caught into that. And then it sadly, it took me until I started working in higher education and working in some community colleges and seeing these incredible programs that, are one-year certificate programs or two-year, associate degree programs. And they could be seen as just, stepping stones to, something else, or it could be seen as a space for non-traditional learners to get back into it, or somebody to skill up in a new field that they are excited about. But how that exists at the K through 12 level is give them that exposure, give them that opportunity to get out into the world and do some project-based learning. Engage with individuals who are in some of these trade programs or trade, bring somebody from the IBEW to come by and talk about what it's like to be, an electrician in Boston. Sure. Or, bring somebody by that, didn't go straight to a four-year university after graduating. I know we have many individuals who have incredible stories, incredible success stories to be able to share that. And I think we really need to flip the script on what the track is for students, and really let them kind of live and lean into what their passions are. And I think the more that we create those spaces, both within the classroom context, as well as continuing to support that through extracurriculars, I think that's where we'll really start to see like true passion for learning.
Okay, excellent. We have about 4 minutes left, so you're going to have 2 minutes to do your close. So for the other 2 minutes, is there anything you want to talk about that we didn't talk about, or is there anything you want to expand upon?
Sure. There's one piece that I would like to just kind of bring a little bit of light to, and I think that's around equitable treatment of school community members, specifically students. And I know when we come to conversations around discipline, it's always tough because no two students are the same, no two situations are identical, and when you have policies and procedures on how to act when, say, there's a case of student conduct that you need to address, there's always going to be some level of murkiness of, well, why was this the decision when you made this decision for somebody else right here? I think, again, this is a conversation around the misunderstanding and the need for clarity on what that process looks like. Again, still respecting the identities of who participated, but I think as a community, we saw, last year a very terrible incident that happened without any level of community apology. And I know there are people in our community that are still really hurting from not just it happening, but also the lack of apology in any type of public way. Fast forward a few more months and you have individuals from another team and there was a conduct issue and there was a rather inconsistent sort of punishment that was laid out. And I think that just kind of needs to be addressed in both a way that's equitable, but also an understanding that punitive measures are not the way to foster safe learning environments. We're being hypocritical if we're saying we're student advocates, but we're putting fear in students to not fail in safe environments, whether it be academically or in social contexts. And I think this is an opportunity for some restorative practices to be incredibly helpful for that students can walk away from, conduct or conduct cases without feeling like they just got punished, but rather that they grew from it.
Okay. You got 1:30 seconds.
Awesome.
To do your close.
Do I stare?
You can stare.
Awesome. I would like to thank everyone in the Duxbury community throughout the last year. As I began this process of joining or running for school committee, I was just met with incredibly warm welcomes, and it gave me an opportunity to see education through a lens of this larger community, whereas I had been on the inside and seeing it through, again, a continued evolving perspective. But at the same time, I leaned heavily into my educational experience. As a former middle school English teacher, as a K through 12 nonprofit education supporter, and now working in higher education, I'm the only candidate that has in-classroom experience, so I know what those conversations look like with students when they're struggling. I'm the only one that has high school or higher education involvement, so I know what those struggles look like when students are transitioning from high school to the collegiate level. I'm there providing supports to make that transition and to ease those pain points, but they're there. And when we look at what's happening at our individual levels of education, we always tend to look back and see what can we do at an earlier level. Well, my ask is that if you want somebody that can support students through that earlier level and can provide them the capacity to support not only themselves, but each other, then I'm the candidate that you should vote for on this upcoming school committee election.
All right. You only went over 2 seconds. Thank you, Sean, for participating in this interview. We wish you the best of luck throughout your campaign and in the election. For our viewers, thank you for joining us. If you're interested in watching replays of this interview, please visit our website, pactv.org/elections, for replay times and online viewing options, including PAC TV's on-demand and streaming service, PAC TV Prime. And please make your choices heard by voting in the election on Saturday, March 26th. Thank you and good day.